In a world where heroes often wear capes, sometimes they come in the form of a kind-hearted teenager. Amaya's split-second decision to rescue her elderly neighbor from a raging fire not only saved a life, but set in motion a series of events that would transform her own. Amaya's days were a whirlwind of responsibility. She'd wake before dawn, help her younger siblings get ready for school, then rush to catch the bus. After classes, she'd volunteer at the local food bank or tutor kids in the neighborhood. At night, she'd pore over textbooks, dreaming of becoming a doctor. But dreams cost money, and in Amaya's tight-knit community, resources were scarce. Cracked sidewalks and peeling paint were common sights. Yet the streets buzzed with life and laughter. Amaya's kindness shone bright, a beacon of hope in a place where hope sometimes felt like a luxury. Little did Amaya know, her ordinary world was about to be turned upside down. A test of courage awaited her, one that would challenge everything she knew and open doors she never imagined possible. As night fell, a musky burning scent drifted through Amaya's open window. What she saw next would force her to make a split-second decision that could cost her everything. Amaya's eyes darted from her textbook to the window, her brow furrowing as she tried to place the unfamiliar smell. Smoke. Her heart skipped a beat as she peered out into the darkness. Orange flames flickered in the distance, illuminating the night sky with an eerie glow. It was coming from Mr. Johnson's house. Time seemed to slow as Amaya processed the scene before her. Mr. Johnson, the quiet elderly man who lived alone, was in danger. She fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaky fingers. The operator's calm voice offered little comfort as Amaya relayed the situation.
"Help is on the way,"
the operator assured her. But Amaya's gaze remained fixed on the growing inferno. Minutes felt like hours. The fire was spreading fast, consuming the old wooden structure with terrifying speed. A cramping fear crept into her stomach. What if Mr. Johnson was still inside? Amaya's mind raced. She thought of her mother, working the night shift, her younger siblings, sleeping peacefully in the next room, her dreams of becoming a doctor, the scholarship applications waiting to be filled out. But then she remembered Mr. Johnson's kind smile when she helped him with his groceries, the way he always asked about her studies, encouraging her to reach for the stars. In that moment, Amaya knew what she had to do. Without a second thought, she bolted out the front door. The cool night air hit her face as she sprinted down the street, her heart pounding in her chest. Neighbors were starting to emerge from their homes, confused and afraid. But Amaya didn't stop to explain. As she neared Mr. Johnson's house, the heat intensified. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mixing with the fear and determination etched across her face. The crackling of the flames grew louder, drowning out the distant wail of approaching sirens. Amaya hesitated at the front porch, her hand hovering over the doorknob. This was her last chance to turn back, to wait for the professionals. But a faint cry from inside made her decision for her. Mr. Johnson needed help now. Taking a deep breath, Amaya pushed open the door. A wall of thick, black smoke engulfed her, stinging her eyes and burning her lungs. She dropped to her knees, crawling along the floor where the air was clearer. The familiar layout of the house was now a maze of danger and confusion. "Mr. Johnson!" Amaya called out, her voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. She strained to hear a response, fear gripping her heart with each passing second. As she inched her way through the living room, a section of the ceiling collapsed behind her. The reality of her situation hit home. This wasn't a heroic movie scene. This was real danger. But Amaya pressed on, driven by a force stronger than her fear. Finally, she heard a weak cough coming from the kitchen. There, huddled in the corner, was Mr. Johnson. The old man looked disoriented, his face streaked with soot. Relief washed over Amaya, quickly replaced by urgency. They needed to get out, fast. "Mr. Johnson, "It's Amaya," she said, grasping his arm. "We have to go now." The old man nodded weakly, leaning heavily on Amaya as she helped him to his feet. Together, they stumbled towards the exit, the heat growing more intense with each step. The journey back through the burning house felt like an eternity. Amaya's lungs screamed for clean air, her eyes watering from the smoke. But she didn't let go of Mr. Johnson, even as her own strength began to falter. Just when it seemed they might not make it, a gust of fresh air hit Amaya's face. They burst through the front door, collapsing onto the lawn as firefighters rushed past them. Amaya gulped in deep breaths, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. As paramedics swarmed around them, Amaya caught Mr. Johnson's eye. The gratitude in his gaze spoke volumes. In that moment, she knew she had made the right choice. Whatever consequences lay ahead, she had saved a life, and that was worth everything. Mr. Johnson was being tended to in an ambulance nearby. Despite the oxygen mask covering his face, Amaya could see the relief in his eyes. She had done it. She had saved him. The reality of her actions began to sink in, and a wave of emotions washed over her. As the chaos around her began to settle, Amaya's thoughts turned to her family. Her mother would be home soon, and her siblings were still asleep, unaware of the night's events. How would she explain what had happened? Would her mother be proud of her bravery or angry at her for taking such a risk? A police officer approached Amaya, notepad in hand. "Can you tell me what happened here tonight?" he asked gently. Amaya took a deep breath and began to recount the events that led to her daring rescue. As she spoke, she noticed a crowd gathering around her, listening intently to her story. Among the onlookers, Amaya spotted her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Thompson. The elderly woman's eyes were wide with disbelief and admiration. "You're a hero, Amaya," Mrs. Thompson called out, her voice cracking with emotion. Others in the crowd nodded in agreement, murmuring words of praise and amazement. Amaya felt a blush creep across her cheeks. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. "I just did what anyone would do," she said softly, looking down at her soot-covered hands. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their life to save another. As the night wore on, Amaya's mother arrived, having been notified by the authorities. She rushed to her daughter, enveloping her in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she alternated between scolding Amaya for her recklessness and thanking God for her safety. As dawn broke, the gravity of Amaya's actions began to sink in. Little did she know, her act of bravery would set off a chain of events that would alter the course of her life forever. The neighborhood stirred to life as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon. The foul smell of smoke still lingered in the air, a stark reminder of the previous night's events. Amaya sat on her front porch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes fixed on the charred remains of Mr. Johnson's house down the street. Firefighters milled about, ensuring no hidden embers remained. Neighbors gathered in small groups, their voices hushed as they recounted the dramatic rescue. Amaya could feel their eyes on her, a mix of awe and concern in their gazes. Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman from next door, approached Amaya with a steaming mug of tea. "Here, dear," she said, pressing the warm cup into Amaya's hands. "You've had quite a night." Amaya accepted the tea gratefully, the warmth seeping into her still trembling fingers. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she murmured, her voice hoarse from the smoke. "What you did was incredibly brave," Mrs. Thompson continued, her eyes shining with admiration. "You're a real hero, Amaya." Amaya shifted uncomfortably at the word hero. She hadn't thought about bravery or heroism when she ran into that burning house. All she knew was that Mr. Johnson needed help, and she was there to give it. "I just did what anyone would do," Amaya replied softly, looking down at her soot-stained hands. Mrs. Thompson patted her shoulder gently. "Not everyone would have risked their life like that, dear. You should be proud." As the morning wore on, more neighbors stopped by to express their admiration and gratitude. Amaya fielded their questions and accepted their praise with a quiet humility that only seemed to endear her more to the community. Amaya's mother, who had been speaking with the fire chief, finally made her way back to her daughter's side. Her eyes were red-rimmed from a mix of worry and pride. "The chief says Mr. Johnson is going to be okay," she said, sitting down next to Amaya. "They're keeping him at the hospital for observation, but he should be released soon." Relief washed over Amaya. In all the chaos, she hadn't had a chance to check on Mr. Johnson's condition. "That's good," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "He asked about you, you know. Wanted to make sure you were all right." Amaya nodded, touched by Mr. Johnson's concern. She had always known him as a kind, if somewhat reserved, neighbor. But there was something in her mother's tone that hinted at more. "There's something else," her mother continued, her voice lowering. "The chief mentioned that Mr. Johnson seemed different, like he was trying to tell them something important, but couldn't quite get the words out." Amaya furrowed her brow. "Different how?" Her mother shook her head. "I'm not sure, but I got the feeling there's more to Mr. Johnson than we know." As the day progressed, the excitement in the neighborhood began to die down. Amaya retreated to her room, physically and emotionally exhausted. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, unaware of the changes that were about to unfold in her life. A few days later, in the early hours of the morning, a knock at the door shattered the quiet routine of Amaya's household. Her mother answered, surprise etching her features as she saw Mr. Johnson, standing on their doorstep. The old man looked remarkably well for someone who had escaped a burning building. Even more surprising were the two police officers flanking him. Amaya's heart raced as she approached the door. Had something gone wrong? Was she in trouble for entering the burning house? Her mother's voice, tight with concern, broke through her spiraling thoughts. "Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson's friend. Please come in," she said, stepping aside to let him and another gentleman enter. The group settled in the modest living room, an air of anticipation hanging heavy in the air. Mr. Johnson's eyes found Amaya, and his face broke into a warm smile. "There she is," he said, his voice filled with genuine affection. "My guardian angel." Amaya felt heat rise to her cheeks at the praise. She glanced at her mother, who looked both proud and slightly apprehensive. They engaged in conversation, and a deep sigh of relief came over the family to hear that he was okay. As Mr. Johnson got up and looked as if he was about to leave, he leaned forward, his eyes twinkling with a secret. "Amaya," he began, "there's something you should know about me." The room fell silent, tension crackling in the air. "I'm not just the retired old man you've known all these years," Mr. Johnson continued. "In fact, I used to run a very successful global business and sold the company for well over 8 figures. I've kept a low profile here and decided to retire here in my childhood town, and I'm growing far too old." Mr. Johnson went on, his voice growing more animated. "Amaya, your act of bravery didn't just save my life. It reminded me of the importance of giving back, of nurturing potential where we see it." He paused, his gaze intense as he looked at Amaya. "I want to help you achieve your dreams. I'm prepared to set up a trust fund or a full scholarship for you to attend any university you choose." The words hung in the air, almost too enormous to comprehend. Amaya felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Her mother gasped, tears welling in her eyes. "Mr. Johnson, that's too much," Amaya stammered, her mind reeling. "I can't accept that." The old man's eyes softened. "Amaya, you risked your life without a second thought. You deserve this opportunity. Please, let me do this for you. I know how hard you work. I can see myself in you." Amaya felt torn. The offer was beyond anything she had ever dreamed possible. It could change her life, open doors she never thought she'd be able to walk through. But a part of her hesitated. clinging to the independence and self-reliance that had defined her for so long. Her mother's voice, thick with emotion, broke through her internal struggle. "Amaya, baby, this is a blessing. Don't let pride stand in the way of your future." Amaya looked at Mr. Johnson, saw the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine desire to help. She thought of her dreams, of becoming a doctor, of giving back to her community. With trembling hands, she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to say." Mr. Johnson beamed, relief and joy evident on his face. "You don't need to say anything, my dear. Your actions spoke louder than any words could." As the reality of the situation began to sink in, questions flooded Amaya's mind. How would this change her life? What doors would open? And how would she navigate this new world while staying true to herself and her community? The lawyer, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "I'm here to help facilitate the legal aspects of Mr. Johnson's gift," he explained. "We want to ensure everything is done properly and transparently." Amaya nodded, grateful for their presence. It made the surreal situation feel more grounded, more real. As the group began to discuss the practicalities of Mr. Johnson's offer, Amaya found herself looking out the window at her neighborhood. The streets she had known all her life suddenly seemed different, full of possibility. She thought of her classmates, her neighbors, all the people struggling to make ends meet. How could she use this opportunity to not just better her own life, but to lift up her community? Amaya's decision to accept Mr. Johnson's offer marked the beginning of a journey she never imagined possible. But as new doors opened, familiar ones began to close. Would success come at the cost of losing touch with her roots? The days following Mr. Johnson's visit were a whirlwind of activity. Amaya's mind raced with possibilities as she and her mother met with more lawyers and financial advisors to set up the trust fund. The numbers discussed were staggering, far beyond anything Amaya had ever dreamed of. As the reality of her new situation sank in, Amaya felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. She couldn't help but wonder how this sudden change would affect her relationships with friends and neighbors. Would they treat her differently now? Determined to stay grounded, Amaya threw herself into her studies with renewed vigor. She enrolled in advanced placement classes and sought out additional tutoring to prepare for college entrance exams. Her teachers noticed the change, praising her dedication and encouraging her to aim high in her college applications. At home, Amaya's family adjusted to their new circumstances. Her mother was able to cut back on her work hours, spending more time with Amaya's younger siblings. The constant stress of making ends meet began to ease, replaced by cautious optimism for the future. Mr. Johnson became a frequent visitor, offering guidance and support as Amaya navigated her new world. He shared stories of his own journey from humble beginnings to success, emphasizing the importance of hard work and integrity. Amaya listened intently, soaking up every bit of wisdom he offered. The once quiet neighborhood now buzzed with hope, inspired by Amaya's actions. Months had passed since that fateful night when Amaya rescued Mr. Johnson from the fire. Mr. Johnson, inspired by Amaya's hard work and recognizing that he could possibly do more for his community, decided to use some of his wealth and build a community center where his house used to be. This would be a hub for underprivileged kids could visit to learn, play, and develop their futures. The community center, once a dilapidated building on the verge of collapse, now stood as a beacon of progress. Its freshly painted walls and gleaming windows were a testament to the power of collective effort and shared vision. Inside, the center hummed with activity. In one room, Amaya led a study group, her voice clear and confident as she explained complex mathematical concepts to her peers. Gone was the hesitant girl who once shied away from attention. In her place stood a young woman who commanded respect not through force, but through knowledge and compassion. "Remember," Amaya said, her eyes scanning the eager faces before her, These formulas are just tools. The real power lies in how we apply them to solve real-world problems. As the session ended, Amaya caught sight of Mr. Johnson watching from the doorway. His eyes twinkled with pride as he observed the transformation of the shy girl he had known into this poised young leader. "You've come a long way, Amaya," Mr. Johnson remarked as they walked through the bustling hallways. "How does it feel?" Amaya paused, considering her answer. "It's overwhelming sometimes," she admitted, "but in a good way. I feel like I'm finally able to make a real difference." One day, as Amaya walked through her neighborhood, she noticed a young girl helping an elderly woman with her groceries. The scene transported her back to her own childhood, reminding her of the small acts of kindness that had once defined her days. In that moment, Amaya realized that her journey had come full circle. She had become the change she wished to see in the world, inspiring others to follow in her footsteps. Success hadn't changed Amaya. It had amplified the best parts of who she had always been. As she continued her walk, Amaya's mind buzzed with new ideas. There was still so much work to be done, so many lives to touch. But she no longer felt overwhelmed by the challenges ahead. Instead, she felt a sense of purpose and determination. As Amaya stood in the community garden that had replaced Mr. Johnson's burned-down house, she reflected on her journey. The simple act of rushing into a burning building had set off a chain of events that transformed not just her life, but her entire neighborhood. She realized that heroism wasn't about grand gestures, but about small acts of kindness and courage performed every day. It was about facing fears, standing up for others, and believing in the power of community. Amaya's story had inspired others to take action, proving that one person could indeed make a difference. As she looked around at the thriving garden and bustling community center, she saw living proof that bravery and compassion could create ripples of positive change. In that moment, Amaya understood that true success wasn't measured by personal gain, but by the lives touched and the communities uplifted along the way.